A tiny raccoon cub was cruelly thrown away like garbage, with no hope of being seen again. But his trembling paw reached the heart of a lonely woman, sparking a journey of tears and laughter. From despair to miracles, from playful mischief to healing a whole town. This is a story you won't be able to turn away from until the very last moment. The rain had a tired way of falling over Cedar Creek that afternoon, steady and thin, the kind that slicked the blacktop and made the dumpsters behind the old lumber mill shine like dented tin coffins. The mill had closed years back, leaving a gravel lot where dandelions poked through and a faded sign leaned on one hinge. The town still used the back lane for overflow trash, cardboard from the diner, lawn bags from the bungalows, a broken rocking chair with one arm missing. The small losses people didn't want to think about after supper. In the largest dumpster, under a flap of wet plastic and a paper grocery sack gone to mush, a raccoon cub lay quiet as a forgotten toy. He was too small for the deep metal box he'd been tossed into, too small for the cold that crawled up from the steel floor and settled in his bones. Motor oil had smeared into his baby gray fur. One back leg bent wrong, toes splayed, the kind of bend that made the world tilt. A thin line of blood had crusted along his brow where he'd clipped the rim coming down. When he tried to lift his head, the world swam. When he tried to cry, it came out as a whisper no louder than rain on paper. The town's noise reached him in bits. The screen door at Maggie's diner slapping open, a pickup idling at the four-way stop, a dog bark ricocheting through the alley. None of it belonged to him. His world had shrunk to the sour smell of cabbage leaves and coffee grounds, and the drumming of water on metal. Every so often, he pressed his small hand, 5 little fingers black as a child's glove, against the dumpster wall to feel the cool, to say in a way that wasn't words, "I am still here." The mischief that should have been the whole of him, the nosing into things, the bright-eyed curiosity raccoons were blamed and loved for, flickered now like a pilot light. Even so, it showed itself in quick, stubborn sparks. He pawed at the loosened tab on a tuna can, nudged a straw wrapper as if it might be a worm, tugged at the corner of the wet grocery sack until it gave with a papery sigh. Each tiny act cost him, but it was living work, the kind babies do even when no one is watching, investigating, insisting, a tiny, "What's that?" in the dark. Up the alley, the miller's porch light came on, though it was only 5 in the afternoon. People in Cedar Creek turned on lights the way they checked on one another, out of habit, without thinking it heroic. A boy on a red bicycle rattled past, hitting every puddle he could find, and whooped at the splash. Somewhere close, a feral dog barked again and then again, that sharp, hollow sound of an animal looking for advantage. The cub flinched. He could hear nails scrabble on the wet gravel, slow and sniffing, closer than before. He tucked his face into the crook of his uninjured leg and went still the way wild things do when they're small and the world is big. The lid of the dumpster banged once in a gust and then fell back. Water ran in sudden strings along the inside wall and pooled near his belly. He shivered, and, because being small doesn't mean you don't have opinions, he made a tiny noise of complaint. A squeak, more than a cry. It surprised him enough that he did it again, louder this time. The answer was a sniff, right at the seam of the dumpster, and a huff that fogged the cold air. He could smell the dog now, the rank, wet fur smell, the hot breath. The sniffing moved along the dented side, a steady drag of nose and patience. The cub held his breath and tried to be nothing at all. A truck rolled into the lane then and stopped with a crunch of gravel. The engine coughed once and cut. A door opened, and a pair of work boots hit the ground. The dog's nails stuttered, then scuffed away at a trot, insulted by interruption. A man with a ball cap and a bright safety vest hauled a couple of lawn bags to the nearest bin. The rain darkened the brim of his cap. He lifted the lid, wrinkled his nose, and heaved the bags in. The liner tore, and a string of brown leaves slumped down the side. He swore softly, banged the lid twice, and then, as if he'd heard something but wasn't sure, paused. The cub made no sound. The man shrugged, wiped his hand on his jeans, and climbed back into his truck. The engine started. The taillights smudged red in the drizzle and disappeared down the alley. The quiet that came after felt heavier than the noise had been. The cub's chest hitched. He wasn't old enough to understand what had happened to him, or why he was alone, only old enough to know that being alone is a cold place. He tucked one hand into his fur at the neck, like a child might clutch a blanket. A soda tab glinted near his nose, and he nudged it again and again, the tiny click an anchor, to keep from floating away. On Maple Street, 3 houses over from the alley, a woman stood at her sink, rinsing coffee grounds into a filter. Linda Carter's kitchen window looked out toward the mill through a lattice of rain and telephone wires. She had lived in that house for 38 years, long enough to know which cupboard door stuck and which floorboard announced you shamefully if you sneaked to the fridge after 10. Her husband had built the fence. He'd planted the maple now taller than the roofline. He had been gone 4 years and 8 months, and she could tell you the exact angle the first winter sun cut across the empty side of the bed and the way you start to talk out loud to a photograph without meaning to. She spooned grounds into the filter, set the pot, and waited for the small noises, drip and hiss, that friendly kitchen talk that says time is passing in a bearable way. The rain gave the whole street a soft-edged look. At the curb, 2 trash cans leaned into each other like old men trading stories. A wind gust pushed them together and they clucked lids. She smiled without meaning to. Little things still did that to her sometimes, and she let them. When the coffee was on, she lifted the trash bag from under the sink, tied it off, and wrangled her way into a raincoat hanging by the back door. It was the yellow one her students had called the banana slicker. She pulled up the hood and told herself not to forget the mail while she was out. Her grandson would call later to tell her about spelling words. Monday spelling was a ritual, as fixed in her week as church and watering the philodendron. The back steps were slick, the rail cool under her hand. The lane smelled like wet cedar and old cardboard. She knew the alley's shape by heart, how the puddles formed near the drain, where the gravel had washed down into the low spots, the long shadow the dumpsters threw at supper time. She stepped carefully, the way you do when you're old enough to see the fall before you feel it. She'd meant only to lift her lid, toss in the bag and be done, but a sound, small and thin and not the kind of sound you ignore, threaded through the rain. It wasn't the dog's bark or the clatter of a loose lid. It was softer than that and more deliberate. She stopped with her hand on the trash can handle and turned her head to listen, that reflex her years in a classroom had honed. Hear the whisper under the noise. There it was again. A squeak, then silence, then another squeak with a stubbornness in it that reminded her of a boy in first grade who'd insisted the letter S hissed because it was a snake and shouldn't be trusted. The sound came from the direction of the big dumpster by the mill wall, the one everyone used when their own cans were too full for the lid to close. She looked toward it, and then back at her own can. The rain stitched the space between them. She could pretend she hadn't heard. She could tell herself it was a loose hinge, a rat, the kind of alley life you don't go courting. But the sound came again, and it hit a place in her chest she didn't let many things touch. She set her bag down and walked toward the big bin. Her boots sank a little in the soft gravel. She tested the slick metal step with her toe, felt it shift under her weight, and put both hands on the cold rim. The lid gave reluctantly and then lifted, water sluicing off the back edge and spattering her coat. The smell rose. Coffee grounds, onion peels, damp cardboard, that sharp oil scent that seems to live in any place machines have ever been. She leaned in, blinking against the rain. At first, she saw only shapes. Bags, a collapsed box, a chair leg with a rusted bolt still clinging. Then the paper sack near the back shivered. Not much, just a quiver, like something beneath it had sighed. She steadied the lid with her shoulder and reached in, fingers feeling for edges, for a place to grab that wouldn't tear. The sack gave way in her hands, wet and soft as tissue, and slid aside. He was there, small, the size of a man's slipper, mask crooked by a streak of oil. One eye squeezed shut, the other a soft, dark bead taking her in, and not quite believing. He made the sound again, that stubborn, scratchy squeak, and lifted one little hand off the metal in a slow, careful motion. It wasn't much of a reach. He wasn't strong enough for much. But he offered it, the way a child offers a pinky to seal a promise. Linda's breath left her in a soft "oh." It wasn't a word and it wasn't prayer, but it carried the shape of both. The lid wanted to fall, heavy and impatient, and she should have let it. She should have gone for help, called animal control, fetched gloves, done the dozen sensible things a woman alone in a raincoat is supposed to do in an alley with a wild thing. Instead, she eased the lid back farther with her shoulder and put her hand out, palm up, the way she'd taught shy children to do on the first day of school when a class pet needed gentle touching. His little fingers, cool and a bit tacky with oil, rested on the web of skin between her thumb and forefinger. He didn't grip. He just laid the hand there as if to say, "I'm telling you I'm still here." The alley and the rain and the long, empty years drew down to the size of that touch. From the far end of the lane, a door banged. A man's voice called to a dog. And tires hissed past on maple. Linda didn't move. The raccoon's chest fluttered under the matted fur, quick and uneven. She could feel the tremor of it in the tiny hand. She swallowed, found her voice in the place where it had hidden since the day the hospice nurse had shut off the oxygen machine, and spoke in the steady, practical tone she'd used 1,000 times to keep a roomful of first graders from tipping into chaos. "Okay, little fella," she said softly. "Okay, I hear you." She slid her other arm over the rim, feeling the cool bite of metal through the raincoat, gathering the wet grocery sack out of the way. Somewhere behind her, a dog gave that sharp, opportunistic bark again, closer now, the scrabble of nails on gravel quickening. Linda glanced over her shoulder, then back at the small face in the dim. The raccoon blinked, slow and trusting in a way wild things don't often allow themselves. He lifted his hand a fraction more, the tiniest insistence. "Okay," she said again, and the word felt like a decision, even before she'd named it as one. She shifted her weight, reached deeper into the cold, and the lid began to slip. Rainwater sheeting down. She braced, jaw set, rain running off her hood and into the collar of her coat, and fixed her eyes on the little hand still resting in her palm. Linda braced her arm inside the dumpster, steadying herself against the slick metal rim. Rainwater slid down the sleeve of her yellow coat and trickled cold into her cuff. The little raccoon cub's paw stayed where it had landed, barely more than a weightless brush of fingers against her hand, yet it anchored her as surely as if he'd grabbed hold. He was still breathing, faint and shallow, but breathing. That, more than anything, left her unable to look away. "Linda." The voice startled her. She twisted her head, keeping her arm balanced inside the bin. Rick Johnson stood a few yards off, a plaid cap pulled low, his hunting jacket darkened by rain. He was carrying his own garbage bag, swinging it like a pendulum as he came down the lane. His old hound, Buddy, sniffed along the puddles behind him. "What are you doing digging in that mess?" he called, coming closer. Then he saw the cub and gave a derisive snort. "Well, I'll be... You found yourself a trash panda." Linda stiffened. "He's hurt." Rick set his bag down and leaned an elbow on the rim, peering in without flinching at the smell. "Of course he's hurt. Half dead by the look of him, and wild. You don't want to mess with that, Linda. Call animal control. Let them put it down quick. No sense dragging it out." The words landed like cold stones in her chest. She looked back at the tiny creature, fur matted with oil, chest fluttering under ribs too sharp for comfort. His one open eye, dark, glossy, imploring, met hers as if he understood. He shifted, making that scratchy squeak again, not much louder than the rain. "He reached out to me," Linda said, more to herself than to Rick. Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "That's instinct. Grasp at anything nearby. Don't get sentimental. You'll only get bit. Raccoons carry God knows what." Buddy barked once, loud enough to make the cub flinch. Linda raised her shoulder higher to shield the small body. "Don't," she said sharply. Rick lifted his brows. "I'm just saying. That thing's suffering. Letting it go now is kinder. Besides, you're not equipped for this. You live alone. What are you going to do with a wild raccoon? Raise it like a house cat?" Linda didn't answer right away. Rain hissed on the dumpster lid, and her heart knocked with the same stubborn rhythm that had driven her to teach children their letters long after her bones ached from standing. She studied the cub, the way his little hand still pressed into her palm, though he had no strength left for anything more. She thought of the quiet house waiting for her, just beyond Maple Street, the empty side of the bed, the stillness that followed her everywhere. "He deserves a chance," she whispered. Rick sighed and bent to pick up his garbage bag again. "Suit yourself, but don't come knocking when it bites you or dies on your kitchen floor. Best leave wild things wild." He trudged away, Buddy padding at his heels, the sound of their boots and paws fading under the rain. For a moment, Linda almost let the lid fall. Almost. She could return to her coffee pot and her spelling words call with her grandson, put this sight out of mind like so much else. The practical voice in her head reminded her she was 62, with bad knees, on a fixed income. She had no business taking on this burden. Then the cub's paw twitched again, just a fraction, but enough to remind her of a child's hand seeking hers in a crowded hallway, trusting her to guide the way. She felt the same pull now, old as her bones and deeper than common sense. "All right," she murmured. "We'll try." The decision snapped into place the way some choices do, like it had been made long before she admitted it. She slid both arms into the bin, lifted carefully, and gathered the small body against her chest. He weighed less than a bag of flour. Heat radiated from him, feverish, but his limbs dangled limp. She tucked him inside her coat, cradling him close, and the little head lolled against her collarbone. The walk back to her house seemed longer than usual, her eyes scanning every shadow for Rick reappearing to scold her, or some neighbor glancing from a porch. She half expected someone to stop her, demand she explain what she was doing carrying a wild animal under her raincoat. But Cedar Creek was the kind of place where people kept to themselves if they thought you were working something out. Inside, she laid him gently on an old towel by the kitchen heater. The cub shivered once, curled in on himself, and then went still again. She crouched beside him, her knees protesting, and pressed 2 fingers lightly against his side. The tiny ribcage rose and fell in uneven spurts, still alive. Her mind raced. She knew the small-town vet, Jacob Miller, more for his reputation than any personal dealings. He'd treated her dog Molly years ago, before Molly's back legs gave out, and before Saul, her husband, had slipped into the long illness that ended in the hospice wing. Dr. Miller was known to be brisk, efficient, not given to sentiment, but he was good. If anyone could give this raccoon cub a chance, it was him. Linda rose, fetched an old flannel shirt from the laundry basket, and wrapped the cub gently, leaving his head uncovered. He stirred weakly, gave a faint squeak, and burrowed his nose into the fabric as though seeking warmth. She couldn't help but smile through the tightness in her throat. She gathered her keys, purse, and the damp bundle, then hesitated at the door. The house was warm, the heater humming, the coffee pot gurgling in the kitchen. She could stay, tell herself she had done enough. But when she looked down at the little face, half hidden in plaid flannel, she thought of Rick's words, put it down quick, and knew she could never forgive herself if she let that be the story's end. She opened the door, stepped into the rain, and headed for her car. The drive through Cedar Creek was short, but every red light felt like a trial. She kept glancing at the passenger seat where the bundle lay, half expecting to see the small chest stop moving. Once, she thought it had, and she leaned over at a stop sign, holding her breath, until she saw the faint flutter again. The veterinary clinic sat at the edge of town, its porch light burning against the grey. Linda parked crooked, hurried inside with the bundle pressed close. The bell above the door jingled, and the receptionist, a young girl with blonde curls damp from her own dash through the weather, looked up in surprise. "Mrs. Carter," she said, recognizing her from church socials. "What do you have there?" "A raccoon," Linda answered, her voice steadier than she felt. "He's dying. Please get Dr. Miller." The girl's eyes widened, but she nodded and disappeared through the swinging door. Moments later, Dr. Miller himself appeared, tall, silver-haired, with a pressed shirt that looked incongruous against the smell of antiseptic and wet fur that hung in the room. His gaze dropped to the bundle in Linda's arms. "A raccoon cub," he said flatly. "Where did you find it?" "In a dumpster. Someone threw him away like trash." Her voice broke on the last word, but she held the doctor's eyes. "Can you help him?" He sighed, motioned toward the examination room. "Bring him in. Let's see what we're dealing with." Linda followed, her shoes squeaking on the tile. She laid the bundle gently on the steel table, peeling back the flannel. The harsh light showed every wound, every mat of blood and oil. Dr. Miller's expression remained professional, but his hands softened as they examined the tiny body. Fractured leg, severe dehydration, infected cuts. "He's in bad shape, Mrs. Carter. I won't lie to you. The odds are low." Behind them, the receptionist had lingered, her face stricken. "But he's alive," she whispered. "Yes," Dr. Miller said. He looked at Linda, his gaze steady, unreadable. "If you want me to try, it won't be cheap, and it may not work. Are you prepared for that?" Linda glanced down at the cub. His eye, the one not swollen shut, fluttered open and fixed on her. Against all reason, against everything Rick had warned, she felt that look tether itself to her heart. She reached out, stroked the small paw resting on the steel, and whispered, "Yes, do everything you can, whatever it costs." The doctor gave a short nod, already turning to his cabinets. "Very well. Let's see if we can give him a fighting chance." As the instruments clinked, and the machines hummed to life. Linda stood with one hand on the tiny paw, the rain still dripping from her coat, her heart beating in rhythm with the fragile breath of a creature who had been thrown away, and whom she refused to let go. The steel table gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the air inside the small exam room smelled of antiseptic and damp wool from Linda's raincoat. She stood close, hands folded tightly together, watching as Dr. Miller moved around the table with the calm economy of a man who had been doing this work for decades. He spoke little, only the clipped directions to his assistant, but every motion of his hands carried certainty. He palpated the cub's side with gloved fingers, adjusted the tiny rib cage with delicate precision, and murmured to himself the words of diagnosis: fractured femur, dehydration, severe infection. Linda heard every word and tried to swallow them as if they were stones. The raccoon cub lay motionless, except for the faint quiver of his chest. A strange feeling pressed against her throat. That same tightening she remembered in the last days of her husband's illness, when each breath he drew sounded like it might be the last. She had sworn she would never sit at another bedside waiting for a life to end. Yet here she was, leaning forward as if her own will might breathe strength into the small body before her. The assistant, the young blonde girl whose name tag read Sophie, hovered nearby. She was hardly older than Linda's youngest grandson, with the nervous energy of someone new to the job. Her eyes flicked often to Linda, full of concern, and something softer, maybe admiration for the older woman's determination. "Do you want me to set up the oxygen, Doctor?" she asked. "Now," Miller answered briskly. "And prep the IV line. We'll try fluids first." Sophie scurried out, the swinging door flapping behind her. Linda stepped closer to the table, unable to help herself. The cub's fur was still damp, the matted grey marked with streaks of oil, but up close she could see faint rings around his little eyes, the mask of his kind. Even covered in grime, he looked mischievous, as if under better circumstances he might already be plotting which cupboard to raid or which porch to climb. "Is he in pain?" Linda asked quietly. Miller didn't pause in his work. "I imagine he is. Broken bones hurt. Infection hurts worse. He's in shock. If we can stabilize him, he'll feel it then. Right now, he's too weak even to protest." Linda felt a shudder ripple through her. She reached for the towel she'd wrapped him in, tucking it closer around his body, and whispered, "You're safe now, little one. Just hold on." The door burst open again, and Sophie returned with an oxygen mask sized for small animals and a tray of supplies. As she laid them out, Linda noticed her shoulders trembling, either from the cold or nerves. The girl placed a small teddy bear from her pocket next to the cub, almost shyly. "I keep it here for nervous pets," she explained, glancing at Linda. "Sometimes it helps." The sight of the raccoon cub's limp paw, resting against the faded bear's ear, tore something open in Linda's chest. She wanted to reach out, to stroke his tiny hand, but hesitated, remembering Rick's warning about disease. Still, the need for connection won out. She extended one finger and brushed it gently against his paw. To her astonishment, the cub's fingers twitched and then curled, just barely around her fingertip. "He's reaching for you," Sophie breathed. Dr. Miller looked up, his brow furrowed but said nothing. He adjusted the mask over the cub's face, turned on the flow of oxygen, and inserted the IV with the deftness of long habit. The cub didn't resist, didn't even flinch. His chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. Linda stood rooted, the weight of that tiny grip pulling her deeper into a promise she hadn't spoken aloud. She knew how many responsibilities she had already. Grandchildren who expected birthday cards on time, a church that leaned on her to bake pies for fundraisers, a garden that waited for her attention. And yet, looking down at the raccoon cub clinging weakly to her finger, she understood none of it mattered if she let him slip away. The minutes passed in silence, broken only by the hiss of oxygen and the rustle of gloves on plastic. Linda lost track of time, watching only the faint rise and fall of the cub's ribs. Every so often, Dr. Miller muttered an observation: temperature low, pulse thin, hydration beginning to stabilize. These words she clung to like a lifeline. Finally, Miller straightened and peeled off his gloves. His expression remained guarded, but he met Linda's eyes squarely. "He's critical, but he's not gone. Tonight will tell us more. If he makes it through, he'll have a chance." The words fell heavy and hopeful at once. Linda pressed her hand to her mouth, nodding. "I'll stay," she said. The doctor raised a brow. "There's nothing you can do for him in here. We'll monitor him. Come back in the morning." But Linda's feet refused to move. "I'm not leaving him," she said firmly. "Not tonight." For a moment, the two locked eyes, the efficient man of science and the gray-haired widow who had carried a dying raccoon through the rain. Something in her voice, the grit of it, softened him. He gestured toward a chair in the corner. "Very well. But understand, Mrs. Carter, there may be nothing anyone can do." Linda sat heavily, rainwater dripping from her coat onto the tile. She folded her hands in her lap, the knuckles pale, and fixed her gaze on the small bundle under the oxygen mask. The world narrowed to the faint hum of machines, and the fragile fight for life playing out on the steel table. Outside, the storm thickened, wind rattling the clinic windows. But inside, in that circle of fluorescent light, a woman who had already lost too much leaned forward, watching over a small creature who had been thrown away, determined that this time she would not walk away before the story was done. The steel table gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the air inside the small exam room smelled of antiseptic and damp wool from Linda's raincoat. She stood close, hands folded tightly together, watching as Dr. Miller moved around the table with the calm economy of a man who had been doing this work for decades. He spoke little, only the clipped directions to his assistant, but every motion of his hands carried certainty. He palpated the cub's side with gloved fingers, adjusted the tiny rib cage with delicate precision, and murmured to himself the words of diagnosis: fractured femur, dehydration, severe infection. Linda heard every word and tried to swallow them as if they were stones. The raccoon cub lay motionless, except for the faint quiver of his chest. A strange feeling pressed against her throat, that same tightening she remembered in the last days of her husband's illness, when each breath he drew sounded like it might be the last. She had sworn she would never sit at another bedside waiting for a life to end. Yet here she was, leaning forward as if her own will might breathe strength into the small body before her. The assistant, the young blonde girl whose name tag read Sophie, hovered nearby. She was hardly older than Linda's youngest grandson, with the nervous energy of someone new to the job. Her eyes flicked often to Linda, full of concern and something softer, maybe admiration for the older woman's determination. "Do you want me to set up the oxygen, Doctor?" she asked. "Now," Miller answered briskly, "and prep the IV line. We'll try fluids first." Sophie scurried out, the swinging door flapping behind her. Linda stepped closer to the table, unable to help herself. The cub's fur was still damp, the matted gray marked with streaks of oil, but up close she could see faint rings around his little eyes, the mask of his kind. Even covered in grime, he looked mischievous. as if under better circumstances he might already be plotting which cupboard to raid or which porch to climb. "Is he in pain?" Linda asked quietly. Miller didn't pause in his work. "I imagine he is. Broken bones hurt. Infection hurts worse. He's in shock. If we can stabilize him, he'll feel it then. Right now, he's too weak even to protest." Linda felt a shudder ripple through her. She reached for the towel she'd wrapped him in, tucking it closer around his body, and whispered, "You're safe now, little one. Just hold on." The door burst open again, and Sophie returned with an oxygen mask sized for small animals and a tray of supplies. As she laid them out, Linda noticed her shoulders trembling, either from the cold or nerves. The girl placed a small teddy bear from her pocket next to the cub, almost shyly. "I keep it here for nervous pets," she explained, glancing at Linda. "Sometimes it helps." The sight of the raccoon cub's limp paw resting against the faded bear's ear tore something open in Linda's chest. She wanted to reach out to stroke his tiny hand, but hesitated, remembering Rick's warning about disease. Still, the need for connection won out. She extended one finger and brushed it gently against his paw. To her astonishment, the cub's fingers twitched and then curled just barely around her fingertip. "He's reaching for you," Sophie breathed. Dr. Miller looked up, his brow furrowed, but said nothing. He adjusted the mask over the cub's face, turned on the flow of oxygen, and inserted the IV with the deftness of long habit. The cub didn't resist, didn't even flinch. His chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. Linda stood rooted, the weight of that tiny grip pulling her deeper into a promise she hadn't spoken aloud. She knew how many responsibilities she had already. Grandchildren who expected birthday cards on time, a church that leaned on her to bake pies for fundraisers, a garden that waited for her attention. And yet, looking down at the raccoon cub clinging weakly to her finger, she understood none of it mattered if she let him slip away. The minutes passed in silence, broken only by the hiss of oxygen and the rustle of gloves on plastic. Linda lost track of time, watching only the faint rise and fall of the cub's ribs. Every so often, Dr. Miller muttered an observation: temperature low, pulse thin, hydration beginning to stabilize. These words she clung to like a lifeline. Finally, Miller straightened and peeled off his gloves. His expression remained guarded, but he met Linda's eyes squarely. "He's critical, but he's not gone. Tonight will tell us more. If he makes it through, he'll have a chance." The words fell heavy and hopeful at once. Linda pressed her hand to her mouth, nodding. "I'll stay," she said. The doctor raised a brow. "There's nothing you can do for him in here. We'll monitor him. Come back in the morning." But Linda's feet refused to move. "I'm not leaving him," she said firmly. "Not tonight." For a moment, the two locked eyes. The efficient man of science and the gray-haired widow who had carried a dying raccoon through the rain. Something in her voice, the grit of it, softened him. He gestured toward a chair in the corner. "Very well. But understand, Mrs. Carter, there may be nothing anyone can do." Linda sat heavily, rainwater dripping from her coat onto the tile. She folded her hands in her lap, the knuckles pale, and fixed her gaze on the small bundle under the oxygen mask. The world narrowed to the faint hum of machines and the fragile fight for life playing out on the steel table. Outside, the storm thickened, wind rattling the clinic windows. But inside, in that circle of fluorescent light, a woman who had already lost too much leaned forward, watching over a small creature who had been thrown away, determined that this time she would not walk away before the story was done. The clinic had settled into the heavy silence of night. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, throwing a harsh glow across the stainless steel tables, but the stillness felt more like a church than a place of medicine. Outside, the storm had quieted to a steady drizzle, raindrops slipping down the dark windows. The smell of disinfectant and damp fur lingered in the air. Linda sat in the chair in the corner, her back stiff, her coat draped over her knees. She had been there for hours, barely moving except to shift when her legs cramped. Every now and then, she leaned forward, watching the small rise and fall of the cub's chest beneath the towel. Each breath seemed fragile, borrowed, as though the air itself had to decide whether to stay in him or not. Dr. Miller had finished the initial treatments, IV fluids running slowly, antibiotics delivered, the tiny body swaddled with care. He worked with the precision of a man who measured his life in cases won and lost. He did not allow hope to rise in his voice, only facts. But Linda caught the way his hand lingered just a little longer on the cub's chest when he checked the heartbeat, the way his shoulders softened for a moment when he adjusted the oxygen mask. The door opened with a squeak, and young Sophie slipped in again. She was supposed to be finishing her shift, but her wide eyes told Linda she couldn't stay away. She carried a blanket folded over her arm and a mug of tea that steamed in the cool air. "For you," she whispered, handing the mug to Linda. "Chamomile. You'll need it." Linda took it, the warmth seeping into her fingers. "Thank you, dear." Sophie sat on the floor beside the exam table, chin resting on her knees. She peered up at the raccoon cub, her voice hushed. "He looks so small, like he doesn't even weigh a pound." "He doesn't weigh much more," Dr. Miller replied dryly. He was jotting notes on a chart but didn't look up. For a long time they stayed in silence, listening to the drip of the IV and the whisper of the oxygen machine. Linda thought of her late husband, Saul, how the machines had sounded in his final days, and for a moment grief threatened to overwhelm her. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall here. Not now. Then it happened. The cub stirred. His paw twitched beneath the towel, shifting restlessly as though testing its strength. Linda leaned forward, heart pounding. Slowly, with a trembling effort that seemed to draw on every last shred of his energy, the raccoon lifted his tiny hand and extended it outward. It was not a wild swat, not a frantic scratch. It was deliberate, searching. His small black fingers reached into the empty space as if groping for connection. Without thinking, Linda rose and stepped to the table. She placed her hand near his, palm up, offering what she had. The cub's paw lowered gently, landing against her skin with surprising tenderness. The touch was feather-light, almost weightless, yet it carried a gravity that drew the breath from her lungs. Sophie gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. "Did you see that? He's reaching for you!" Even Dr. Miller paused in his note-taking. He looked up, his expression hard to read, but something in his eyes had shifted. "Strange," he muttered. "That's not instinct. He should be conserving energy, not seeking." Linda's throat tightened. She curled her fingers slightly, careful not to squeeze, and whispered, "I see you, little one. You're not alone." The cub gave a faint squeak, a sound barely audible, but it sent a shiver through the room. Then, as though reassured by her presence, his paw went slack again, resting in her palm while his chest rose in another shallow breath. The air seemed different afterward, charged, fragile, like the pause after a hymn when no one wants to break the silence. Sophie's eyes glistened with tears. Even Dr. Miller stood straighter, clearing his throat and setting down the chart as if unwilling to miss another moment. Linda stayed there, her hand beneath the tiny paw, until her legs ached. She remembered the countless small hands she had guided in her classroom, the way children reached out with unspoken trust. This was the same, yet sharper. It was not only trust, it was a plea, and it was hope. Finally, Miller spoke again, his tone quieter than before. "We'll keep him overnight. Critical observation. If he makes it to morning, his chances improve." Linda nodded, but did not move her hand. She leaned closer to the cub's face, studying the faint rings of fur that marked his eyes, the twitch of his whiskers. Mischief still lived there, buried beneath pain, like a spark waiting to catch. She whispered, "You hang on, and I'll be here. I promise." The hours that followed were long. Sophie eventually slipped out, returning once with a blanket for Linda's shoulders. "Doctor." Miller checked vitals at intervals, his shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum. The rain outside softened to a mist, and midnight came and went. Every time Linda's eyelids drooped, she forced them open again. She refused to miss the moment his breathing steadied, or the moment he might slip away. She had walked out once before, years ago, when the nurse told her Saul's fight was over. She had gone home to fetch a sweater and returned too late. She would not make that mistake again. Sometime around 3 in the morning, the cub stirred once more. This time he didn't reach out, only shifted closer to the teddy bear Sophie had left on the table. With a faint effort, he tugged at the ear and tucked it under his chin. The sight drew a soft laugh from Linda even through her tears. "Still a rascal," she murmured. "Even half dead, you want to steal." The laugh broke the heaviness in the room. For the first time that night, Linda felt something like light pushing through. Not certainty, not yet, but the barest flicker of it. She settled deeper into her chair, the cub's paw still resting in her hand, and allowed herself to breathe in rhythm with his fragile breaths. When dawn finally bled pale over Cedar Creek, the first bird calling from somewhere beyond the rain-wet streets, Dr. Miller entered the room with his coffee and checked the cub's vitals again. He straightened, pulled off his stethoscope, and said, "He's still here, stronger than last night." Linda exhaled a shaky breath and closed her eyes, whispering thanks into the sterile air. She squeezed the tiny paw gently and felt, for the first time in years, that she was not the only one holding on. The night at the clinic stretched on like a road with no end. The small exam room had become a world of its own. Humming machines, the soft rattle of rain on the window, and the fragile rhythm of a raccoon cub fighting for breath. Linda sat stiff in the corner chair, her hands folded together so tightly that her knuckles ached. She would not leave. She had promised herself that once, long ago, she would never again turn her back when life was slipping away. Dr. Miller had checked the cub's vitals near midnight, his eyes steady but not unkind. "Critical," he had said, his voice flat. "If he makes it through the next 6 hours, he'll have a chance." Then he had left to do rounds in the kennels, leaving Linda alone with the small body on the table. The cub, Lucky, the name had not yet been spoken, but she felt it whispering already, lay swaddled in the flannel shirt she had brought from home. His little chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, each one a victory, each one a threat that it might be the last. The oxygen tube hissed softly, and the IV drip ticked with its steady rhythm. Linda leaned forward, straining to hear the faint squeaks he made now and then, as if even unconscious he refused to be silent. The door eased open again around 1 in the morning. Sophie slipped back inside, her blonde curls flattened with dampness, a thermos in her hand. "Couldn't sleep," she whispered. "I thought you might need something warm." She poured tea into a paper cup and set it beside Linda. Then, without asking, she settled on the floor by the table, her knees drawn up under her chin. For a long while they said nothing. The girl's presence reminded Linda of her former students, the ones who lingered after class because they didn't want to go home yet. It stirred something protective in her, though tonight she herself was the one in need of comfort. Around 2 o'clock, the cub stirred. His paw twitched against the towel, and his head tilted toward the small teddy bear Sophie had left earlier. With surprising determination, he dragged it closer with his weak fingers and tucked his nose into the worn fabric. The sight made Sophie let out a trembling laugh, quickly stifled by her hand. "He's cuddling it," she whispered, "like he knows it's his." Linda smiled through the heaviness in her chest. "Still mischievous," she murmured. "Even half dead, he wants to claim something for himself." The moment lightened the air. For a few minutes, they both allowed themselves to imagine that such a spark meant more than it probably did. That little act of possession, the raccoon cub clutching a ragged bear, felt like defiance against the night. But the hours dragged, and with them came fear. At 3, the cub's breathing grew erratic. His sides hitched, then stilled, then hitched again. The monitor beeped, soft but insistent. Linda rose so quickly, her chair clattered behind her. She gripped the edge of the table. "He's slipping," she cried, her voice sharp. Sophie scrambled for the call button. Within moments, Dr. Miller appeared, his coat rumpled, his eyes narrowing as he leaned over the cub. He adjusted the oxygen, checked the IV line, and pressed his stethoscope to the tiny chest, the room filled with the tense sound of professional silence. Finally, he exhaled. "He's still with us, just fighting harder now." Linda pressed her hands to her heart, tears brimming. "Don't you give up," she whispered fiercely to the cub. "Not now. Not after all this." Sophie looked at Linda then, her own eyes wet. "He hears you," she said softly. "I think he does." Dr. Miller straightened, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Talk to him if you want," he said, almost grudgingly. "Sometimes voices make a difference." Then he left them again, the door swinging shut behind him. So Linda pulled her chair close to the table, so near her knees touched the cold metal. She laid her hand gently beside the cub, close enough that if he wanted, he could reach for her again. She began to speak, her voice low and steady, words tumbling out like an old habit returning. She told him about her garden, about the tomatoes that always grew crooked, about the maple trees Saul had planted that still shaded the yard. She spoke of her grandchildren's laughter on summer afternoons, of the smell of cookies baking at Christmas, of the choir's hymn that still made her cry, though she tried not to. Her stories wove into the sterile air, soft and human against the beeping of machines. And then, against all reason, the raccoon cub stirred. His paw inched toward her hand, weak but determined. With the barest effort, he laid it across her fingers. His eyes did not open, but the gesture was clear. Sophie gasped again. "He's holding on to you." Linda bent low, her tears falling onto the flannel shirt. "That's right, little one. Hold on, I'm right here." The hours between 4 and dawn were a vigil. Linda never left his side. Sophie dozed against the wall, her head tipped back, but Linda stayed awake, whispering whenever the cub's breaths grew shallow, her words a rope to keep him tethered. Sometimes she thought she saw the faintest twitch of his whiskers, the smallest stir of recognition. When at last the first light of morning crept through the rain-streaked windows, Dr. Miller entered again. He studied the cub for a long moment, then checked the heartbeat. His face softened just enough for Linda to notice. "He's still here," he said quietly, "and he's stronger than he was 6 hours ago." Linda pressed her lips together, unable to speak. Relief swept through her so powerfully, she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. She glanced at the little paw still resting across her hand, and for the first time in years, she let herself pray. Outside, Cedar Creek stirred awake. The church bell rang the early hour, and cars rolled slowly down Maple Street. But inside the clinic, under the sterile lights, an old woman and a broken raccoon cub breathed in rhythm together, two survivors refusing to let go. And as the new day began, Linda felt the faintest spark of hope, fragile as dawn, but real, take root in her chest. It was not just the raccoon who had survived the night. It was her own heart too, long numb, now daring to beat with possibility again. Morning in Cedar Creek came gray and hesitant, as if the sky itself wasn't ready to believe in good news. The rain had eased into mist, and the street outside the veterinary clinic smelled of wet cedar and earth. Inside, the sterile hum of the fluorescent lights felt different now. For the first time since Linda had carried the raccoon cub through the door, there was something in the room that hadn't been there before, the fragile breath of possibility. Dr. Miller bent over the little body again, his stethoscope pressed gently against the cub's chest. His silver brows knit in concentration, but when he straightened, Linda caught it, the barest flicker of surprise, softening his stern expression. "He's breathing stronger," he said. "It's not much, but it's better than last night." Linda's hand tightened on the chair back. "So he might live?" "I said stronger, not safe," Miller replied. But his tone lacked its usual finality. "Still, he's not where I expected him to be at dawn. That's worth noting." Sophie, who had returned with a tray of fresh supplies and a hopeful bounce in her step, clapped her hands softly. "See? He's a fighter. I told you, Mrs. Carter, he hears you." Linda smiled faintly, but said nothing. She moved closer to the table where the cub lay swaddled in the flannel shirt. His small chest rose with effort, but it rose. His whiskers twitched as though chasing a dream. She leaned over him and whispered, "You did it. You made it through the night." The cub stirred then, slow and careful, lifting his head just enough to blink one glossy dark eye. It was gummy with fatigue, yet focused. For the first time he seemed to truly see her. Then, in a gesture that pulled the breath right out of her chest, he stretched out his paw once more and laid it against her hand. "He remembers you," Sophie breathed. Linda swallowed against the lump in her throat. "Or maybe he's reminding me," she murmured. The mood lightened when, an hour later, the cub gave his first sign of mischief. Sophie had left a pen on the exam table while she took notes. The raccoon cub, still weak but curious, reached out with surprising accuracy. His tiny fingers hooked the pen and pulled it clumsily across the metal surface. The noise startled both women. Linda laughed in spite of herself, a full, unguarded laugh she hadn't heard in her own voice in years. "Look at him," Sophie exclaimed, eyes wide. "He's already causing trouble." Miller, who had re-entered with a clipboard, frowned. "That's not trouble. That's neurological response." But even he couldn't disguise the way his mouth twitched at the corners when the cub dropped the pen and then pawed at it again, as if daring someone to take it back. By mid-morning, the cub had enough strength to nuzzle against the teddy bear Sophie had given him. He dragged it close with his paw and buried his nose into its worn fur. The sight pulled another ripple of warmth through the room. Even Miller, adjusting the IV line, paused long enough to watch. "He's not out of danger," the doctor reminded them, though his voice was gentler now. "The infection is still a battle, and that leg won't heal quickly. But he hesitated, unusual for him. There's will in him. Sometimes that counts for more than we know. Linda sat with him through the day, her chair pulled close to the table. She spoke quietly, telling him little stories about her garden, about the grandchildren who raced across her porch in summer, about the maple tree that Saul had planted long before he grew sick. Each time she paused, the cub's ears flicked as if he were listening. Sometimes his paw stretched just enough to brush her hand again, as if urging her to keep talking. The hours brought tiny victories, a steadier breath, a faint squeak that was more complaint than weakness. By afternoon, Sophie offered him a shallow dish of water. They watched, holding their breath, as his nose twitched over it. Slowly, he leaned forward and lapped a few drops. The sound of his tongue against the dish was so ordinary, so alive, that Linda felt tears spring hot to her eyes. "Good boy," she whispered. "You're still here." As dusk fell, the cub's stubborn spark revealed itself again. When Sophie left a shiny thermometer on the edge of the table, he pawed it clumsily, then tugged until it clattered to the floor. The noise echoed through the quiet clinic, and the cub let out what almost sounded like a chittering laugh. Sophie bent to pick it up, shaking her head in mock scolding. "You little bandit, you're already stealing." Linda chuckled, brushing her hand over his tiny head. "That's what raccoons do. They take what isn't theirs and dare you to take it back." The laughter faded into a softer silence, but the air was different now. Less like a funeral vigil, more like the first day of spring when you notice a bud pushing stubbornly through the frost. Linda sat back in her chair, exhaustion tugging at her bones, but her heart beating lighter than it had in years. Later that night, as Dr. Miller checked the cub once more before heading home, he paused at the door. "Don't think this means he's safe," he said, though his tone lacked its usual sharpness. "But he's shown me something I didn't expect, and that matters." When the door closed behind him, Linda leaned close to the cub again. His paw twitched against her fingers, not weakly this time, but with intention. She smiled through tears. "You stubborn little rascal," she whispered. "You're going to make it, aren't you?" The cub blinked once, as if answering, then curled tighter against the teddy bear. And for the first time, Linda allowed herself to believe it might be true. By the end of the week, the cub no longer looked like a piece of refuse pulled from a dumpster. His fur, still patchy and dull, was slowly regaining its natural sheen. The swelling around his injured leg had eased, and the fever that had threatened to burn him away had finally broken. He was not out of danger, but he was undeniably alive. And with that life came something else, his true nature. Linda came to the clinic every morning, carrying with her the patience of a schoolteacher and the tenderness of someone who had been lonely for too long. Each time she entered the room, the cub would perk up, one dark eye fixing on her as if he had been waiting just for her. It was Sophie who first laughed and said, "He knows you. You're his person now." Linda had blushed at that, murmuring something about how raccoons were wild creatures, not pets. But in her heart, she felt the truth of it. One morning, Sophie entered with a bowl of softened fruit, a cautious step toward real food. "Let's see if he's ready for this," she said cheerfully, setting the dish down. The cub sniffed at it, then nosed the banana slice with disdain. Instead, his tiny paw darted toward Sophie's pocket, which held a wrapped granola bar. Before she could react, he tugged at the shiny wrapper with surprising determination. "Hey!" Sophie laughed, retrieving it. "That's mine." The cub chittered, a raspy little sound that could have been a laugh of his own. Linda shook her head, but she was smiling. "A thief already," she said. "You really are a rascal. It was then she called him Lucky, a name that seemed to fit with uncanny perfection. "Because that's what you are," she whispered, as she stroked his head. "Lucky to be alive. And maybe I'm lucky too, to have found you." From that day on, Lucky lived up to the name. He developed a habit of reaching through the bars of his kennel to snag anything within reach. Pens, thermometer covers, even the string of Sophie's ponytail one afternoon, which sent her squealing and laughing as she tried to free herself. Dr. Miller rolled his eyes at the antics, but even he had to admit that the spark of mischief meant progress. "He's healing," the doctor said one evening, watching Lucky bat at the teddy bear he had claimed as his own. "Play is a good sign. It means he isn't just surviving anymore, he's living." Yet it wasn't only playfulness that set Lucky apart. There was something uncanny in the way he seemed to notice people, as though he carried an extra sense. When a farmer came in with his aging collie, shaking his head with worry, Lucky extended his paw through the bars of the kennel and brushed the man's sleeve. The farmer froze, then let out a shaky laugh, muttering, "Well, I'll be. That little fellow knows how to comfort a man." Later that same week, Sophie had a hard day. She tried to hide it, but Linda noticed her red-rimmed eyes. She had received bad news about her mother's illness. She busied herself cleaning Lucky's cage, her shoulders tense. Lucky watched her intently, then reached for her hand with deliberate care. His paw rested against her knuckles until Sophie's tears fell freely. "He knew," she whispered to Linda, wiping her eyes. "He knew I needed that." Word began to spread through Cedar Creek about the Raccoon Cub at Dr. Miller's clinic, who not only survived, but reached out to people as though he understood. Folks stopped by not just to check on their own animals, but to peek into Lucky's kennel. Children pressed their hands to the glass, and Lucky would mimic the gesture, paw to palm, which sent them into fits of giggles. Elderly visitors found themselves crying softly when he touched them with that same small hand. Linda watched all of this with awe. She had once guarded her heart so fiercely, afraid of losing again. But Lucky's simple, stubborn presence cracked the wall she had built. She began to linger in the clinic longer, not just to check on him, but to talk with Sophie, to chat with Dr. Miller, to greet neighbors who came by. It was as if the little raccoon's paw had not only reached for her, but pulled her back into life itself. One late afternoon, as the sun spilled golden light through the clinic windows, Linda sat with Lucky nestled against her chest. His injured leg was bandaged, his good eye gleaming with curiosity. He tugged gently at the chain of her necklace, chittering softly. Linda laughed and brushed him away. "That's not yours," she said. "But then again, nothing ever really is it? You just take what you need." Dr. Miller, standing in the doorway, heard her words. For once, his expression softened into something almost wistful. "Sometimes," he said, "what we take ends up giving more back than we expected." Lucky tilted his head then, as if listening, and let out a low, contented purr chitter, pressing his paw once more into Linda's hand. And in that simple, mischievous gesture, Cedar Creek's little raccoon cub proved that survival was only the beginning. He was here to steal more than pens and fruit. He was stealing hearts, one by one. Spring returned to Cedar Creek with the smell of thawing earth and blossoms pushing out along the maple trees. The rains had washed the streets clean, and the town felt, in some quiet way, renewed. At the veterinary clinic, Lucky had become more than a patient. He had become a presence, a fixture people asked about before they even set their own pets on the exam table. His bandages had come off, leaving a faint scar along his leg, and a slight limp when he walked. But it didn't slow him down. If anything, it gave him character, proof that he had walked through fire and come out the other side. Linda came to the clinic each morning, but by now she no longer carried the guarded air of someone bracing for loss. She carried baked bread for Sophie, who often forgot to eat during long shifts. She brought seed packets for Dr. Miller, who confessed, reluctantly, that he'd been meaning to start a small garden out back. Her life, once defined by silence, was now threaded with connections she had never expected to rebuild. And at the center of it all was a little raccoon with bright eyes and a mischievous paw. It was Sophie who had the idea first. "He doesn't just make us smile," she said one afternoon as Lucky reached through the kennel bars to pat the arm of a boy who was crying for his sick rabbit. "He changes people. He heals them." Dr. Miller, ever the skeptic, had opened his mouth to dismiss it, but then he stopped. He was watching the boy's tears dry under Lucky's touch, watching his shoulders straighten with newfound calm. The doctor's mouth closed again, and for once he had no argument. Word spread faster than any of them intended. The story of the raccoon cub thrown away like trash, but who now comforted strangers, made its way into church pews, coffee shop counters, and the booths at Maggie's diner. Soon, families who had never set foot in the clinic came just to see Lucky. They wanted to press a hand to the glass and watch as he raised his paw to meet theirs. Children squealed with laughter when he tapped back at them. Grown men, embarrassed by tears they couldn't explain, left with lighter hearts. It was Linda, finally, who stood at the center of the small gathering at the town hall one Saturday morning. The mayor had called the meeting to discuss a new project, a community rescue fund for injured wildlife. And the symbol chosen for the effort was Lucky. On the banner stretched across the stage, his picture showed him peeking from his flannel blanket, paw extended, as if offering a handshake. When Linda was asked to speak, she felt the familiar tremor of nerves. Public speaking had once come easily, when she had faced classrooms full of bright-eyed children. But grief had dimmed her voice over the years. Now, as she looked out at the neighbors who had known her through all seasons of her life, she felt something stir that hadn't stirred in a long time. Lucky, perched on her shoulder with a harness Sophie had stitched together, gave a soft chitter that made the crowd chuckle. His tiny paw brushed her cheek. "I found him," she began, her voice wavering before settling into steadiness. "In a dumpster, discarded like nothing more than garbage. I almost walked away. Truth is, I've walked away from a lot these last years. Loss makes you do that. Makes you afraid to reach again. Afraid to care. But he reached for me first. He asked me, in the only way he knew how, not to leave him behind. And because I didn't, he taught me that healing doesn't come from hiding. It comes from holding on." There was a hush in the room, broken only by the raccoon's impatient squeak as he tugged at the microphone cord with nimble fingers. The laughter that followed was gentle, full of affection. From that day, Lucky became more than Cedar Creek's miracle. He became its reminder. He spent his mornings at the clinic, where frightened children found comfort in his paw against their hands. He spent afternoons visiting the senior center, where widows and veterans alike felt something mend inside them when he climbed into their laps and chittered softly, his whiskers twitching with curiosity. Wherever he went, he carried his mischief too, stealing buttons, tugging on shoelaces, tipping over unattended cups of tea. But instead of annoyance, these antics brought laughter, the kind of laughter that turns heavy hearts lighter. As months passed, Linda's home, once silent, now rang with life. Lucky followed her through the rooms, pawing at cupboard doors, clambering onto the couch, curling into her lap when evening fell. On the porch, when neighbors passed by, he pressed against the screen door and chattered, earning himself the role of unofficial greeter. Children began calling Linda's house the Raccoon's place, and she didn't mind. It was on the anniversary of the day she had found him that the town gathered again, this time in the park. The mayor unveiled a new wooden sign, carved by a local craftsman, Lucky's Haven, Community Wildlife Rescue. Behind it stood a modest shelter, built with donations and volunteer hours, a place where other discarded animals would be given the chance Lucky had been given. Linda stood near the front, Lucky cradled in her arms. She thought of Saul then, of the years she had spent closing herself off, and of how a little creature, once broken and unwanted, had opened her heart again. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but for once, they were not only tears of sorrow, they were tears of gratitude. When the ribbon was cut and the applause rose, Lucky wriggled free and scrambled up onto the podium. He raised his paw high, the gesture that had become his signature. The crowd quieted as though on cue, watching. A child in the front row lifted her hand back toward him, and then another, until dozens of hands were raised in the air. Lucky chittered, slapped his paw against the microphone stand, and the park filled with laughter and tears all at once. That night, back at home, Linda sat in her chair with Lucky curled against her chest. The house no longer felt empty. The silence was no longer hollow. She stroked the raccoon's soft fur and whispered, "They threw you away like trash. But you've shown us all that nothing living is worthless. You've given us more than I ever dreamed." Lucky tilted his head, his dark eye gleaming in the lamplight. Then, with deliberate care, he placed his paw against her heart. The touch was feather light, but its meaning was enormous. And in that moment, Linda realized the truth that Cedar Creek had already come to know, that sometimes the smallest hands, be they human or raccoon, are the ones that lift us back into life. The cub who had been left to die in the shadows had become the heart of a town, a thief of sorrow, and a giver of hope. And as he drifted to sleep in Linda's arms, his paw still resting over her heart, she smiled and whispered into the quiet room, "Lucky, you saved us all." If this little raccoon's journey touched your heart, drop a simple comment. Just type 0 or 1, so I know you were here with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because there are many more stories like this waiting for you. Stay with us, and let's share the next chapter together.